The pavement of Glenford's Old Market Street was hot enough to cook on. That was not a saying. That was just a fact on this particular afternoon, when the summer heat had climbed past 43 degrees and the air sat over the city like a heavy wet cloth that had forgotten how to be wet. There was no breeze. There were no clouds. The sun pressed down on every roof, every awning, every square inch of gray stone with the kind of patience that made people feel personally targeted. Most of the shops on Breck Lane had shut early. The produce seller had gone home at noon. The old tailor 2 doors down had pulled his sign inside before lunch and not come back out. Even the pigeons had vanished, which said something, because pigeons never vanished. Dr. Aldrich Bowen had stayed open until 3 o'clock out of habit more than hope. He was a veterinarian, and a fairly good one, but not even the most dedicated pet owner in Glenford was going to carry their sick cat through 43-degree heat for a routine check. The clinic had been empty since morning. His assistant Owen had spent most of the day reorganizing the supply cabinet and complaining about it quietly to himself, which Aldrich did not mind. It was better than silence. At 3 in the afternoon, Aldrich decided that enough was enough. He was 61 years old, slightly too heavy for the weather, and he had a fan at home that worked better than the one in the clinic. He told Owen to start closing up. He pulled on his hat, which did almost nothing useful, and he went to the front door to bring in the small wooden sign that hung on a hook beside it. He opened the door. The heat hit him like something solid. He reached for the sign, and that was when he saw the thing at the base of the wall. It was small. That was the first thing he registered. Small and low to the ground, tucked against the stone wall of his clinic like it was trying to press itself into the shadow that was barely there. It was curled in on itself, which made it hard to see what it was at first. Copper-colored, scaled, a tail wrapped tight around a small body, 2 little feet pulled in close. A child. Not a human child. A Dracari child. Aldrich had seen Dracari before, of course. Glenford had a small community of them in the northern quarter, mostly keeping to themselves. They were tall when full-grown, bipedal, covered in scales that came in a range of colors from deep charcoal to pale gold. They had narrow faces, amber or green eyes, and a secondary organ near the sternum that kept a small regulated flame alive inside them. They did not breathe fire the way the old stories said. They breathed smoke sometimes, and heat, and when they felt strong emotion, the flame inside them showed at the edges at the nostrils, at the throat. This child's flame was not showing normally. Aldrich crouched down. He was not a fast man, and his knees made a sound, but he got down low and he looked properly at the child. The scales were dull. That was wrong. Dracari scales in good health caught light, even in shade. These were flat and gray at the edges, the copper color washed out like old paint. The breathing was shallow. He could see the tiny chest moving, but barely. And at the nostrils, instead of the steady warmth a healthy young Dracari would show, there were small involuntary sparks. Little stutters, like a flame trying to catch on wet wood. He had read about this. He had read about most things, which was one of the qualities that made him a decent vet. Dracari internal flame regulation depended not just on temperature, but on moisture in the air. The organ that maintained it drew on the body's own water reserves when the air was too dry. In extreme dry heat, the cascade was quick dehydration, mineral loss, and then the flame went unstable. The sparks at the nostrils were not a sign of health. They were a sign of a system shutting down. Aldrich put 2 fingers gently against the side of the child's neck, where the pulse ran closest to the surface in Dracari anatomy. It was fast, too fast, and weak. He did not stand there thinking about it for long. He picked the child up. He was careful about it, one arm under the small shoulders, one under the knees, the way he lifted injured animals that needed support without pressure on the chest. The child was light. Too light, probably. The scales were warm against his arms, much warmer than the air, which told him the body temperature was running too high. He carried the child inside and let the door close behind him with his foot. Owen was at the back of the clinic when he heard the door. He came around the corner, took one look at what Aldrich was carrying, and went very still for exactly 1 second. Examination table, Aldrich said. Move the tray. Owen moved the tray. Aldrich set the child down, gently, on the padded surface. The child's eyes were closed. The small sparks at the nostrils continued their unsteady rhythm. Is that a? Owen started. Yes, Aldrich said. He was already pulling the overhead light to the right angle and reaching for his assessment kit. Flame starvation. Dry heat. Not enough moisture in the air for the regulation organ to work properly. Give me the humidity readings for outside, check the weather board. Owen went. Aldrich kept his eyes on the child. He worked the way he always worked, which was without wasted movement and without noise. He checked the pulse again, checked the temperature at the neck and chest, looked at the color of the membranes at the inner corner of the eyes, which in Dracary showed blue when oxygen was low. They were blue. He was already forming a plan. He had treated non-terrestrial animals for 20 years. He had treated 3 adult Dracary in the last decade, always for minor things: a joint infection, a respiratory issue from local pollen, a dietary reaction. He had the xenobiology database. He had the equipment. He had the basic minerals he would need. What he did not have was permission from the Dracary community, or a parent, or any kind of official authorization to be treating one of their children. He thought about that for approximately 2 seconds. Then he went to get what he needed. Behind him, on the table, the small copper-scaled child breathed in tiny shallow pulls, and the sparks at his nostrils flickered like a candle someone had forgotten to protect from the wind. The xenobiology database on Aldrich's old desk terminal was not fast. It had been old when he bought it, and that was 11 years ago. But it loaded, eventually, and Aldrich had learned a long time ago that patience was not a virtue so much as a professional requirement when you worked with living things that could not tell you what was wrong. He typed with one hand and kept the other on the child's side, monitoring the rhythm of the breathing while the pages loaded. Owen came back with the humidity readings. 12%. That was lower than most deserts. The heat wave had pulled every drop of moisture out of the air and replaced it with nothing useful at all. 12. Aldrich said, mostly to himself. Poor kid didn't stand a chance out there. He found what he needed in the database under a heading that read Dracary Physiological Emergencies Field Reference, 2nd edition. It had been written by a Dracary physician who had agreed to share the information with xenobiological medical communities. The section on flame regulation failure in miners was 3 pages long and dense with terminology, but Aldrich read fast when he needed to. The organ responsible for flame regulation was called the cerec gland. It sat just below the sternum, about the size of a human fist in an adult, smaller in a child. It produced a low-level catalytic reaction that kept the internal flame stable. To do that, it needed a specific balance of minerals in the blood, a stable core temperature, and crucially, enough ambient moisture to avoid drawing water from the bloodstream to replace what it lost through the reaction process. When the air was too dry, the gland pulled from the blood. When it pulled too much, the mineral balance in the blood shifted. When that happened, the gland itself began to malfunction, producing the unstable sparks Aldrich had seen at the child's nostrils. Left untreated, the flame would simply go out. In Dracary, that was not a metaphor. He found the mineral ratios in a sidebar chart and wrote them down on the back of an old appointment card because it was the nearest paper available. Calcium, magnesium, and 2 minerals specific to Dracary biology that did not have common human names, referred to in the text by their chemical designations. He checked his supply cabinet. He had both in compound form, kept for the non-terrestrial animal cases he occasionally handled. Owen, he said, humidity tent, the large one, from the back shelf, and set it to 65%. Owen was already moving. He was a good assistant partly because he had learned not to ask questions when Aldrich's voice had that particular quality of focused quiet to it. There would be time for questions later. The humidity tent was a piece of equipment Aldrich used most often for birds and small reptiles that needed controlled atmospheric conditions during recovery. It was essentially a clear, soft-sided enclosure with a small built-in humidifier and temperature controls. He had bought it second-hand from a wildlife rescue center. It was not beautiful, but it worked. While Owen set it up, Aldrich prepared the saline mineral solution. He worked carefully and slowly, because getting the ratios wrong in a child this small could do more harm than nothing at all. He checked the database 3 times. He rechecked his measurements. The solution came out pale yellow, which the reference said was correct for the mineral concentrations he was using. The child was still unconscious. The sparks had slowed, which could mean either that the flame regulation was stabilizing slightly or that it was failing more completely. Aldrich checked the eye membranes again. Still blue, but not darker. He took that as a neutral sign and kept moving. He administered the solution through a very fine line at the child's inner wrist, which was where Dracary's surface veins ran closest to the skin. He had done this with adult Dracari before, and the anatomy was consistent, just smaller. He worked slowly and kept his touch light. Then he moved the child into the humidity tent and sealed it. The humidifier ran quietly. Inside the tent, the air began to shift from the bone-dry nothing that had almost killed the child to something closer to what a Dracari body expected. 65% was on the lower end of comfortable for them, but it was safe and steady, and it would let the serotic gland stop pulling from the blood. Aldrich pulled a low stool next to the tent and sat on it. He was not a dramatic man, and he did not pace. He watched the small chest through the clear side of the tent and counted the breaths. They were still shallow, but they were no longer stuttering. "Should we call someone?" Owen asked from behind him. He kept his voice low, which was considerate. Already thinking about it. The Dracari Community Liaison Office. Aldrich did not look away from the tent. They'll have contact for whoever this child belongs to. He didn't get here on his own. Someone is looking for him. Owen went to look up the number. Aldrich stayed where he was. He looked at the child properly for the first time since bringing him inside. Small. Probably not much older than 6 or 7 in human terms, though Dracari development was different. The copper scales along the cheekbones were lighter than those on the arms and neck, which according to his reading was normal in young Dracari. The coloring deepened with age. The eyes were closed, amber-lidded. The tail was still curled close, a reflex that did not need consciousness to maintain. The sparks at the nostrils had stopped. In their place, very faint, just barely visible, there was a thin line of warmth. Steady, consistent. The serotic gland was finding its footing again. Aldrich let out a slow breath that he had not entirely been aware of holding. He reached into the tent through the access port and checked the pulse at the child's neck again. It was slower now, stronger, still not where it needed to be, but moving in the right direction. He sat back on his stool. Owen came back to the doorway. I reached the liaison office. They said there's already a Dracari mail asking after a missing child in the market district. They're going to send someone to bring him here. Good, Aldrich said. He did not move from his stool. There was a lot still to do. He needed to monitor the mineral levels, check the fluid rate, watch the temperature readings inside the tent. The next hour was going to matter. But for the first time since he had found the child on his doorstep, the situation felt like it was on the right side of the line. He reached for his notes and kept working. The first thing Ryvan noticed was the smell. It was not a bad smell. It was just a very different one from anything he had encountered before. There was something sharp underneath it, the way certain cleaning agents smelled, but softer than the ones his uncle used at home. There was also something earthy, like soil after rain, which was strange because there was clearly no rain anywhere near this place. And over all of it, something else that he could not name, warm, faintly metallic, the kind of smell that meant living things had been here recently. He opened his eyes. The ceiling was low and white. There was a light above him, a small square one, set to a dim level that did not hurt. He turned his head slowly, which took more effort than it should have, and found himself looking at the inside of a clear enclosure. Through it, he could see the room beyond walls with large pictures on them. Pictures of animals he did not know, with lines marking the bones inside them. Shelves with jars, a desk covered in papers, and a screen showing numbers. He was alive. He took a careful breath. The air inside the enclosure was warm and damp, nothing like the dry hammer of heat he remembered from outside. The moisture settled into his chest like something he had been missing without knowing it. He breathed again, and this time the warmth behind his sternum responded just a little, just a pulse, but it was there. The flame was still with him. He tried to sit up. He made it about halfway before his arms told him firmly that this was not happening yet, and he lay back down. "Easy," said a voice. Ryvan turned his head the other way. There was a human sitting on a small stool beside the enclosure. He was old, as far as Ryvan could judge human ages, with gray at his temples and lines around his eyes. He was wearing a plain shirt with the sleeves rolled up, and he had a piece of paper in one hand that was covered in small writing. He was not looking at Ryvan with the expression Ryvan expected from humans who noticed a Dracari child somewhere unexpected. There was no alarm, no discomfort, no particular expression at all, really, except a focused kind of attention. "You have been asleep for about 2 hours, the human said. "You are safe. You are in my clinic. My name is Aldrich." Ryvan looked at him. "You found me," Ryvan said. His voice came out rough and smaller than usual. "You were outside my door," Aldrich said. "Hard to miss." There was a pause. Riven looked at the ceiling again and then back at the human. His head was clearing slowly, like the way fog moved off the hills in the mornings back in the northern quarter. He remembered the market. He remembered getting turned around between the stalls, following something that had looked interesting, and then not being able to find his Uncle Doran anywhere. He remembered the heat pressing down, heavier and heavier, until his legs had stopped cooperating. He did not remember sitting down against the wall. "You put me in here," Riven said, looking at the enclosure. "Humidity tent," Aldrich said. "Your flame regulation was failing. The air outside was too dry. This brings the moisture up to a level your body can use. How do you feel?" Riven thought about it carefully, because his uncle had always told him to give honest answers to medical questions. "Tired," he said. "Heavy. But the fire is back." He meant the warmth inside his chest, which a human probably had no word for. He touched his sternum lightly with 2 fingers to show what he meant. Aldrich nodded as if this was a normal thing to receive as a patient update. The serotic gland was working too hard with no support. "We gave it some help." He held up the piece of paper briefly. "Mineral solution, saline base, calibrated to your specific ratios. You should feel more normal in a few hours." Riven looked at the paper. He looked at the human. There were many things he wanted to ask, but one of them was sitting closer to the surface than the others, and he was not sure if it was polite to say. His uncle would have told him it was not. His uncle told him many things were not polite that Riven privately found necessary. "Why did you help me?" he asked. "We are not. You're kind." The human was quiet for a moment. Not in the way people were quiet when they were deciding what to say. More in the way people were quiet when they were making sure they said the actual true thing rather than a comfortable version of it. "You were sick," Aldrich said, "and you were right outside my door." That was enough reason. Riven thought about this. In the Dracari community, help across species lines was a serious matter. It came with obligations and formal acknowledgments and a very clear understanding of what was owed and to whom. Even help within the community was tracked that way. His Uncle Doran kept careful account of every favor given and received, not because he was a mean person, but because that was how things were done. It was how order was maintained. Help was not a thing that simply happened. It was a transaction with dignity on both sides. But this human was saying it as if it were obvious, as if the only equation that mattered was, "You were sick. I could help. So I helped." Riven did not have a place to put that idea yet. He held it and looked at it. After a while, he wanted to do the polite thing. In Dracari courtesy, when someone helped you, you offered them a flame salute, a small, controlled breath of warmth, produced with the inner flame, directed slightly upward. It was not dangerous. It was the way you said thank you when words were not enough. He tried. What came out was a very small spark. It jumped from his right nostril, hung in the air for half a second, and went out. He felt his ears flatten with embarrassment, which was a Dracari expression for the same thing a human might feel when their voice cracked at the wrong moment. Aldrich watched the small failed spark with an expression that held nothing like laughter. "It's fine," he said simply. They sat in quiet after that. It was not an uncomfortable quiet. Outside, the light through the high window had gone golden, which meant the day was getting older. The heat was still there, but softer now. The humidifier in the tent made a low, steady sound. Then Owen came to the doorway from the front room. "The liaison office called back," he said, looking at Aldrich. "There's a Dracari male at the front. Says his name is Doran. He says the child is his ward." Riven closed his eyes briefly. His uncle was here. He thought about what his uncle's face was going to look like, and then he thought about what his uncle was going to say, and then he thought about the fact that his uncle was going to say all of it to this human, who had just spent 2 hours keeping Riven alive and did not seem to want anything in return for it. He hoped his uncle would be kind about it. He was not entirely sure his uncle knew how. Doran had been walking for 2 hours. He had walked the length of the market district 3 times. He had checked every stall, every alley between stalls, every corner where a child might sit down to look at something interesting and forget that he was supposed to stay within sight. He had asked 4 market traders and 1 Dracari community member who happened to be passing if they had seen a small copper-scaled child, and none of them had. He had kept his voice level throughout, because showing panic in public was not something Doran did. But his scales had been doing something they had not done since he was young himself. They kept shifting, a shallow ripple across his shoulders, which was what happened when a Dracari body was very afraid and had not been told. When the liaison office contacted him through his comm and told him that a human clinic on Breck Lane had the child, Doran had been across the market. He crossed it in less than 10 minutes, which was fast for a distance that usually took 20. He stopped in front of the clinic. It was a small building, one floor. A sign beside the door said Dr. A. Bowen, veterinarian, exotic and non-terrestrial species. The door was plain wood with a glass panel. Doran could see through it into a waiting area with chairs that were probably comfortable for humans and a front desk with a young human male standing behind it. He pushed the door open. The young human Owen, Doran would learn later, looked up. He did not flinch, which Doran noted. Most humans in close proximity flinched slightly when a full-grown adult Dracari came through a doorway. It was involuntary, not malicious, but it was tiring. "I am here for the child," Doran said. He kept his voice to the formal register, which was the one he used for dealings with non-Dracari. Precise, measured, no unnecessary warmth. "Of course," Owen said. "He's in the examination room. Dr. Bowen is with him. I'll let him know you're here." He disappeared into the back. Doran stood in the waiting room and looked at the walls. There were framed pictures of various non-terrestrial animals, some of which he recognized and some of which he did not. On the front desk, between a jar of pens and a small stack of appointment cards, there was a ceramic object shaped like a door. He did not know what it meant. Then the human doctor came out. He was older than Owen, gray at the temples, with the kind of face that had done a great deal of squinting in its time and was at peace with this. He was not a tall man, but he carried himself without any of the slight stiffness humans often showed in the presence of Dracari. He walked out, stopped a comfortable distance away, not too far, not too close, and looked at Doran with a clear, steady expression. "You're Doran," the human said. "I'm Aldrich Bowen. Your ward is in the examination room. He's awake and his condition is stable. I'll take you to him." No greeting ceremony. No formal preamble. Simply information delivered directly. Doran followed him through a short corridor and into the examination room. Riven was inside a clear, soft-sided enclosure, lying on a padded table, propped up slightly on a folded blanket. When he saw Doran, something in his small face shifted, part relief and part the specific expression of a child who knows they are about to be spoken to seriously. His scales had some color back. Not full, but present. Doran looked at the enclosure, at the equipment attached to it, at the thin line running to Riven's inner wrist. He looked at the numbers on the monitor. He looked at his ward's face. He breathed slowly. "He is well?" he asked, without looking at the human. "He will be," Aldrich said. "He needs a few more hours in the humidity tent and his fluid levels to come up fully. But the serotic gland is stable. He was in early failure when I found him. Another 20 minutes outside would have been serious." Doran received this information and set it aside to feel later, in private. Right now there were obligations to attend to. He turned to face the human fully and drew himself to his formal height, which was several inches above Aldrich's. "I am in your debt," he said, in the form the occasion required. "The medical intervention you have conducted upon my ward without authorization from his family or community constitutes a significant act of obligation between us. I acknowledge the debt incurred. Per our custom, I am required to offer reciprocal arrangement of equivalent value. I ask that you state what you require so that the matter may be settled in proper form." It was, word for word, what the situation called for. Doran had said versions of it before, in other contexts. It was not a cold speech. It was simply the right one. The human listened to all of it without interrupting. Then he said, "No debt. No arrangement. He needed help. I helped. That's the end of it." Doran stared at him. The words were simple. The human had not said them rudely or with any implication of dismissal. He had said them the way someone stated a fact that seemed obvious to them, with no apparent awareness that they were dismantling a social structure Doran had navigated his entire adult life. "That is not," Doran started. "Uncle Doran." Riven's voice came from inside the tent, small and tired and careful. He said it was enough reason. Doran looked at the child. Riven was watching him with amber eyes that were still not fully bright, but were very focused. He had the look of a child who had been thinking something over for some time. Doran did not have a response prepared for this. He was quiet for a moment that lasted longer than he intended. The human filled it without pressure. "I put together discharge notes," Aldrich said, and nodded to Owen, who was in the doorway. Owen brought over a folded sheet and offered it. Owen translated them into Dracary script so your community physician can review the formulation we used. The mineral compound ratios are listed on the back. Your physician may want to keep it for reference. Dry heat events like this one may not be a one-time situation in coming years. Doran took the paper. He looked at it. It was written correctly in the formal Dracary script used for medical documents. The ratios were listed precisely, with sources cited. The human had done this. He had treated the child, kept careful notes, translated them, and was now handing over the complete information for the Dracary community to use. For nothing. Doran stood there with the paper in his hands and felt, for the first time in a very long time, that he did not know what the next right thing to say was. The mineral solution, he said at last. I would like to understand the composition. For the physician. Of course, Aldrich said, and walked to the desk and told him everything. Consul Varric arrived at the clinic just before 7 in the evening. He came alone, which meant he had not brought the problem to the community formally yet. He had chosen to understand it himself first. That was the kind of man Varric was: deliberate, unhurried, not given to noise when silence and attention would serve better. He had been consul of the Glenford Dracary community for 11 years, which was a long time, and he had the particular quality of old things that have been tested. He was hard to move, but not unmovable. He was tall even for a Dracary, dark-scaled with streaks of deep bronze along the jaw and shoulders. His flame, when it showed, was a deep settled gold, the color that came with age and controlled living. He knocked on the clinic door with 2 precise strikes and waited. Owen let him in. Doran was still inside, seated on a chair near the examination room doorway, the discharge notes in one hand, his other hand resting on his knee in the careful stillness of a man who was thinking very hard and not showing it. He looked up when Varric entered and gave the small formal nod of someone acknowledging authority. Varric looked at him, then through the doorway at the humidity tent, and then at the child visible inside it. He looked at all of this for a moment. Then he turned to find the human doctor. Aldrich was at his desk, writing in a patient log. He had not stood up when the consul came in, not because he was being rude, but because he had not heard the door from where he was sitting. Owen touched his shoulder and said something quietly, and Aldrich looked up, saw the large dark-scaled Dracary standing in his clinic, and pushed his chair back and stood. Dr. Bowen, Varric said. Consul, Aldrich said. He did not ask how Varric knew his name. He simply stood in the way of someone who had nothing in particular to hide. I would like to understand what happened here, Varric said. From the beginning. Aldrich nodded. He pulled a second chair to the desk and offered it. Varric sat. Aldrich sat across from him. Owen stayed near the door, quiet. Aldrich told him everything. He told it the same way he had told Doran, without drama and without decoration. He described finding the child, the initial assessment, the decision to bring him inside, the reference database, the humidity tent, the mineral solution, and how he had calculated the ratios, the monitoring process over the 2 hours that followed. He showed Varric the patient log, which was in his own handwriting and laid out with the timestamps of every intervention and every check. He showed the database pages he had used, still open on the terminal. Varric asked questions. They were precise questions, the kind that came from someone who understood medical matters well enough to ask the right things. He asked about the concentration of the mineral compound. He asked how Aldrich had confirmed the correct vein site in a Dracary child. He asked what the humidity levels had been set to and why that specific percentage. Aldrich answered every one without hesitation. Varric listened. He did not write anything down. He did not need to. He was the kind of person who listened with his whole attention and kept what he heard. When the technical accounting was done, Varric was quiet for a moment. He looked at the patient log on the desk. He looked at the terminal with the open database pages. He looked at the small, careful notations Aldrich had made on the appointment card that had become his working reference. Then he asked the real question. You had no obligation to this child, Varric said. You had no agreement with our community. You had not been asked. We have not, as a people, given your kind many reasons for warmth. He paused. Why did you not simply contact emergency services and step back? They would have come. The outcome might have been the same. Aldrich thought about it for a moment. Not because he did not know the answer, but because the question deserved a real answer and not just the first thing that came out of his mouth. Because stepping away takes longer than just helping, he said. The room was quiet. Varric looked at the human across the desk. He had come here expecting one of two things. The first was arrogance, the kind of human who had done something good and wanted acknowledgement for it, who would lean back slightly when the consul arrived and wait to be thanked in a form that felt satisfying. Varric had met that type. It was not rare. The second was anxiety, the kind of human who had done something and was now afraid they had done it wrongly, who would be careful and deferential and apologetic, watching Varric's face for signs of offense. He had found neither. He had found a man who had done a precise and difficult thing under pressure, had documented it thoroughly, had given the community all the information they needed to continue the care themselves, and who now sat across a desk and explained his reasoning in 9 words without a single one of them being about himself. Varric turned his head. He looked at Riven, who was sitting up in the tent now, watching. He looked at Doran, who gave the smallest, most careful nod. Varric stood. He drew himself to full height, which in his case was considerable, and he produced a flame salute. Not the small courtesy gesture, not the social warmth offered between community members at ordinary meetings. The full formal salute deep in the chest, the flame drawn up from the cerebric gland at full intention and released in a controlled breath that showed its true color. Varric's was deep gold, the color that spoke of long life and earned standing. In Dracari culture, the full formal salute was given between individuals of recognized equal worth. It was not given to strangers. It was not given across species lines. It had not been given to a human in Glenford in living memory. The gold flame hung in the air of the small clinic for 3 full seconds before it faded. Aldrich watched it with polite attention. He nodded once. Then he turned to Owen. "Get everyone some water," he said. "It's still extremely hot in here." Owen went. Riven, inside the tent, had not moved since the salute began. He was 9 years old, and he had grown up knowing that the full formal flame was something the oldest and most serious members of his community gave to each other in the rarest of moments. He had never seen it given outside their community at all. He looked at the human doctor, who was now checking something on the monitor with the same expression he wore when he was checking anything else, focused, quiet, entirely unbothered. Riven filed the image away somewhere very deep and very permanent inside himself. He was not sure yet what it would become, but he kept it. The heat wave broke on a Thursday. It did not break gently. It broke the way most things that have been pressing too hard for too long eventually break suddenly, with a great deal of rain and wind and a drop in temperature that made everyone in Glenford step outside and simply stand for a moment, looking at the gray sky with an expression of deep personal relief. The streets smelled like hot stone meeting cool water. The pigeons came back. The produce cellar opened early. 2 weeks passed. On a gray Tuesday morning, a small package arrived at the clinic on Breck Lane. Owen signed for it because Aldrich was in the middle of an examination, a local woman's elderly Tavari lizard with a recurring joint issue, and could not come to the door. The package was wrapped in the heavy gray paper that the Dracari community used for formal correspondence, tied with a dark cord, with a wax seal on the knot. Owen set it on the front desk and waited until the examination was done. Aldrich came out, washed his hands, and opened the package. Inside was a small container, sealed and labeled, holding a pale crystalline compound. Aldrich read the label and was quiet for a moment. It was a Dracari mineral compound used in treating cerebric gland conditions not commercially available through standard supply lines, produced within the Dracari community and rarely shared outside it. In practical terms, it was something that would make treating Dracari patients significantly easier and more precise. The amount in the container was enough to last a year of occasional cases. Underneath the container was a letter. It was written on the same heavy gray paper, in both Dracari script and human script, side by side. The human script version was in careful, formal language that did not quite have the rhythm of a native speaker. It said that Consul Varric, on behalf of the Glenford Dracari community, wished to inform Dr. Aldrich Bowen that the community would henceforth refer their members to his clinic for non-emergency care as needed, and that they would ensure he had access to the compounds and reference materials necessary to treat Dracari patients correctly. It expressed, in the formal Dracari way, that this was not a repayment of debt, because no debt had been registered, but rather a practical arrangement between neighbors. Between neighbors. Aldrich read the letter twice. He set it down on the desk beside the compound container. Owen was watching him from across the room with the expression of someone who was waiting to find out if this was a significant moment or not. Aldrich picked up the patient file for his next appointment and went back to work. Owen took this as the answer and smiled to himself, which he did where Aldrich could not quite see it. 10 days after that, on a morning that had finally remembered what autumn was supposed to feel like, Doran and Riven came to the clinic. Not as patients. Riven was fully recovered. His scales were back to their proper copper brightness, his flame steady, his energy restored to the considerable levels of a young Dracari child who had decided that being sick was a thing that had happened and was now finished with. He walked into the clinic with the slightly formal posture of a child who has been told to behave, and then looked around at everything with the wide amber eyes of a child who finds it very hard to behave when there are interesting things to look at. Doran stood near the door, slightly too large for the waiting room, holding his formality around him like a coat. Aldrich came out from the back. Riven stepped forward before his uncle could begin whatever speech he had prepared. He was holding something with both hands, carefully. It was a small object, not much bigger than his palm, made of copper-colored ceramic with visible thumb marks in the surface where it had been shaped by hand. It was not a polished or perfect thing. It was clearly made by someone who was still learning to make things. It was shaped, imperfectly but recognizably, like a door. Riven held it out. "In our tradition," he said, very seriously, in the careful way of someone who has practiced the exact words they want to use, when you give someone a door, it means you are welcome in my home. For as long as I have a home, you can come to it." Aldrich looked at the ceramic door in the child's outstretched hands. He took it. He turned it over once, looking at it properly, the way he looked at things he intended to remember. "Thank you, Riven," he said. He walked to the front desk and set it down between the jar of pens and the appointment cards. Then he looked at Riven with the same clear, direct expression he always had, and said, "Drink enough water in the heat. And don't wander away from your uncle in the market." Riven's mouth curved. He pulled in a breath, steadied himself, and produced a flame salute small, because he was still young, but controlled and clean, the flame a steady copper orange that held for 3 full seconds before he released it. Doran, standing near the door, had said nothing since they arrived. He said nothing now, but as he turned to leave, with Riven at his side, he stopped for exactly 1 moment in the doorway. He dipped his head, just slightly, the way one person acknowledges another person who has done something real and does not need to be told that it mattered. Then they were gone. Owen waited until the sound of their steps faded from the street. Then he looked at the ceramic door on the front desk, small and imperfect and the color of old coins. "Are you going to keep that there?" he asked. Aldrich had already gone back to his desk. "Yes," he said, without looking up. The ceramic door stayed on the desk of Aldrich Bowen's clinic for the next 11 years, until the day he finally retired and Owen, who had taken over the practice by then, moved it to the same spot on his own desk without being asked. Every Dracari who came through that door saw it. Most of them knew what it meant. Some of them were too young to know, and they asked. The answer was always the same, and it was always short, because the true version of it was short. A child had been sick outside a door, and the person inside had opened it. That was all. That was the whole story. In a universe full of politics and history and 1,000 careful reasons to look the other way, it turned out that was enough. It had always been enough. It just took a small copper-scaled child fainting in the heat for anyone to notice.